Carol Joyce says, give me 20 minutes to engage with you. So I thought I'd engage with you around some, key topics and some emerging topics. And I might have to go here just to make sure I can see stuff. So, all right, let's have a go. So what I want to argue in this brief session, that's good. So that the purpose of much of higher education has shifted from a focus on occupational preparation to increasing a focus on job readiness and employability. And that this, in some sense, changes and makes more complicated the outcomes and processes, but also of higher education, but also importantly, the kind of expectations which are upon higher education. And that central here is the provision and ordering of educational experiences and how students come to engage with them. And central to this is the provision of an integration of students' experience in work and university settings. And this now is a central concern. And I guess this is one audience I perhaps don't have to convince that's the case. And that the purpose is, and the enactment of these provisions, therefore, is important, but no more so than how our students come to engage with them for reasons I'm hoping to elaborate. And that, in particular, students' interest and readiness are key factors. So that's the kind of rough case I want to make. How I'd like to talk about that is a shift in educational purposes, how we kind of try and align the educational purposes with educational intents, what we're supposed to achieve, and the kind of processes that we should be using. A consideration of what we mean by experiences and how they might be adequate. And then briefly some considerations about how we integrate the two sets of experiences and how we enrich experiences for students in the work settings. And I'm just going to refer very, very briefly to that and to some resources. And then the importance of student engagement and readiness, and then three considerations for the future. So there we go. So as I've said, I think there's a shift from that higher education and tertiary education generally used to be about preparing people for occupations. And I've seen all sorts of data from the 1970s where employers said, we don't care, just give us folk and we will shape them to our enterprise, because then they were hungry for workers. But things have changed. And I guess earlier, what was the basis of courses that were taught in tertiary education? Well, what might be described as the ideal curriculum. And that is what scholars believe should be taught. And it was people in higher education institutions that had a lot of say in the content and the sequencing and all those things. Then, I guess, there was a move to have involvement by professional bodies to shape the curriculum. And so all of a sudden, the capacities of teachers and the experience of teachers became, in some sense, subservient to statements of occupational competence. And I've been around at Griffith long enough to remember when we had a staff meeting when I first joined it, where the head of school said, what we teach reflects the research expertise around this table. And I think we've come a long way from that. And in recent times, there's this shift then from consideration of preparation for occupations to preparation for employment, and this notion of job readiness, of making people able to move smoothly and swiftly into effective practice. And I guess this might be seen as being the grounded curriculum. It's aligned with the effective enactment of knowledge and very much the situated nature of work performance and learning for it. And I'm sure, again, I don't have to convince anybody here that what a nurse, a doctor, a hairdresser, we don't train hairdressers in Griffith, do we? Whatever, how they practice their work is quite different depending upon where they live and where they practice. We all know that what a nurse does in the university hospital across the road will be quite different than what a nurse does in a small regional city, and then small remote community, and then, for instance, a nurse based on a mine site. We all know that, for instance, that doctors in regional and rural communities, general practitioners have a very, very different work profile, for instance, than somebody across the road, and perhaps the GP that we go to. So this is now suggesting then it needs to be a particular focus on the situations where our graduates go to. Now this is an extremely tough educational goal. Firstly, it's difficult to achieve, to understand exactly the requirements of the kinds of work that our graduates will do, even if we knew where they were going. But of course, in the vast majority of instances, we don't know the actual employment destinations of our students. And I think in some sense this is almost unprecedented in terms of the requirements and the requests for people to be so well prepared so they move smoothly into employment. And I think this pressure is going to increase as we have increasing numbers of students graduating from higher education. And the only instances I can think that aren't precedent are where there's been very close affiliations between large teaching hospitals and universities, but have very, very close associations. And all of this is happening at a time of restrictions in resources and facilities available to support this. So at a very time when there's almost the need for tailoring students' experience and providing them with specific support, there are serious constraints in terms of the kind of funding which is available. It's great to hear the kind of support that folk are getting here in health from the previous presenter, but that doesn't occur in lots of other areas. So in terms of the purposes of tertiary education, I find it helpful to return to Dewey. He proposed that there were two key purposes for education for occupations. The first one was to help identify to what occupation individuals are suited. And this, the idea that people might be directed towards a particular occupation by their scores at school or tertiary education, but they might not be well suited to do that work. The fit might not be good. And the second point that Dewey made was that once a person has identified the occupation to which they're suited, then we give a lot of attention to assisting people develop the capacities to practice that occupation. I'm sure if Dewey was alive in the contemporary times, he would add a third element to that, and that is to assist people sustain their employability across lengthening working lives. And now, our government is expecting us to work until 70. And clearly, the kinds of understandings and procedures and values that we learn or we teach students at their initial occupational preparation are going to change significantly across lengthening working lives. So I think it's worthwhile then considering these three forms of educational purposes in terms of how we respond to these with educational intents and the kind of process and the experiences we provide for students. And by the way, I think the first one is probably the one that we don't do terribly well at. And that is, I think, and that's a general comment about education per se, that in this country you're probably aware that over 50% of apprentices do not complete their apprenticeship. Female apprentices, young women, who somewhere like 90% of the female apprenticeships are in hairdressing, and they dutifully work through their 3-year apprenticeship and then leave in droves at the end of it. And there's some similar figures with nursing, and it seems that, for instance, in those occupations, young women make choices about occupations at the same time they're forming gendered identities, the same way that young men do, but young men appear to bail out of courses earlier rather than continuing with them. So the basis of their decision-making may not be terribly informed. So on this table, what I've tried to do, this was for this talk, and it's not wholly coherent, but Down the left-hand column are those three purposes. And then what I've saw is the type of educational intents. So to help people understand the particular occupation they want to engage in, or for instance specialization, if you're dealing with something like medicine or engineering, it's kind of important to know what you want to specialize in. Then there might be a particular set of experiences to achieve that goal. That might be about orientating people to the workplace. It might be providing them with access so they can actually see the occupation in action. And it might be then the opportunity for students to meet, to share and compare and contrast. So, for instance, in a study I did with colleagues from Aberdeen about junior doctors, what in Britain they're called FY1 and FY2 doctors, some of the junior doctors made significant changes in their choice of specialisation based upon what they experienced. And there's one woman I remember, she wanted to be a surgeon. And possibly because of the experiences she had in the surgery part of the hospital, she elected to change her specialism quite radically to become a radiologist. No, radiographer. Radiologist, sorry, I was getting those two mixed up. And so made a significant change. And one can't help wondering whether it was the kind of work environment that took her from wanting to be a surgeon into going in a very different direction, and perhaps a form of work which is far more contained and manageable. Don't know. In terms of developing occupational capacities, then there's this issue about how do we do that? What kind of experiences do we provide, and how we might do it? And so engagement in and rehearsal of work-related activities, progressively engaging in more demanding activities, and supporting the development of the kind of knowledge required for work. And then the third goal, which is about sustaining employability across lengthening working lives. There might be then opportunities to develop what I refer to as personal epistemologies, which are the kind of capacities that students have to manage their own learning, to engage with the workplace and others in a way which is interdependent, which would allow them to learn across their working life. And here some experiences that might develop that would be pedagogic practices that build students' personal epistemologies to support interdependent learning across working life. Now, the simple point here is that there are going to be, these experiences are very different depending upon what kind of goal is to be achieved and how we might go about that. So that it's important then that if we're working in a situation with limited resources and key knowledge to be learnt, we need to be circumspect, we need to be clear about the kind of experiences that we want to develop the kinds of knowledge that our students require. So in terms of the adequacy of experiences, it seems that we need to remember that there's both the provision of experiences and then the process of experiencing. And so the provision of experiences that are those encountered in or organised through university or practice settings. This is what students are provided with, and this is what is afforded them. But we also need to remember that students actually engage with these workplaces on their own terms. They make sense of what they experience and how they come to interact and engage with particular sets of experiences. So, for instance, going back to the world of medicine, medical education, a colleague from a small Lithgow, that's what it's called, Lithgow, isn't it? Just over the Blue Mountains. I used to know it years ago because it used to have Triumph. It used to have a factory that made women's lingerie, and I used to be in the clothing industry many years ago. And part of the requirement to be a medical student in New South Wales is to do 3 weeks practicum in the bush, away from country placement. And the medical students get very good treatment. There's accommodation found for them. There's a nice sort of welcoming ceremony when they arrive, afternoon tea and all this sort of stuff. And they're made to feel welcome and given interesting things to do. But a lot of the students don't want to engage. And engage just in a very superficial way to meet their requirements, and then at the tick of the clock, in the car, back to the big smoke. And part of that is because these students view this as not a good use of their time. They do not see themselves ever working in a rural setting or a small regional hospital. They're positioned to see themselves doing very well in their medical courses, position themselves to being one of the better specialisms, which then will see them putting catheters in your or my hearts or whatever it is, and charging about $17,000 a go to do it. So that although they've been afforded this great experience, they're not going to engage with it. So we need to be clear about the provisions then, what is to be achieved, and how are students likely to engage with them. Another example is, I was talking to a senior clinician in Townsville a couple of years ago, and he was talking about the problems that they have with doctors who are training as pediatricians working with young children. And the problem is that they themselves very rarely have younger siblings, and they also, when kids come into hospital, increasingly their parents come with them. So they don't have a lot of opportunity to actually interact with children themselves. And when you've got to stick a needle in a child, there's got to be some kind of interaction. And I half humorously suggested to him that, well, actually what the medical student should do is go and spend a week in the local kindergarten, in the sandpit with the kids, so that they know how to interact with them. I said it half humorously, but there's probably a serious intent behind that as an experience to develop people's skills of working with young kids. The question is, though, how would a terribly earnest medical student think about romping around in a sandpit with kids? Don't know. So, and so in terms of process of experiencing learner readiness, which is not just the capacities, but also the interest to engage, is going to be a key concern. Now, in thinking about these, this stuff, and I've just brought these two handouts here because I thought a lot of you would have seen this one here. This is a product of a National Teaching Fellowship I had earlier, which looked at some curriculum considerations for integrating experiences, and then over the page here, there was a whole set of considerations for pedagogic issues associated with what do we do with students before, during, and after their practicum experiences to try and secure a richer integration. And then this other little handout here is the work that comes from my current ARC Future Fellowship, which is about how do we, this one here, which is about how do we enrich students' learning experience in the workplace, or workers, it doesn't really matter, in the workplace. And here I offer views about the kind of workplace curriculum, the sequencing of experiences, and sets of pedagogic practices which can be used in workplaces such as storytelling, verbalization, pedagogically rich activities, guided learning, heuristics, mnemonics, artifacts, etc. So we've got some sort of ideas about how we can enrich those experiences. But I have to move on. I thought I would just draw your attention to a current national teaching grant I've got, probably certainly the last one I'll ever have with OLT, because it doesn't exist anymore. And this is a project which built upon the National Teaching Fellowship. And in this, we realized that once the students had had the experiences, that this was an excellent opportunity to engage with them, for them to compare and contrast their experiences and to learn, because they had something to negotiate others with. And so in this current project, what we're doing is doing post-practicum interventions. And there's 2 rounds of these. The first one is occurring across 2016. There's 14 of them across 5 universities. Quite a lot of them is happening within Gold Coast Health. And then in 2017, 30 new projects come in. And essentially what happens is that we're going to have a developmental conference over at the hospital. We couldn't find a room at Griffith, incredible. So we had to have it over at the hospital in February, and then the 14 projects will report their findings, and 30 new projects will come and engage with these 14 projects and learn things from them, and then institute another 30 projects across 15 universities and 23 disciplines in 2017. And so that's this gig. Now, as part of this grant, what we thought would be a good idea is to actually survey students about what they want from these experiences. And we surveyed them, and actually all the students who responded to this survey were from the healthcare sector, including quite a few from our august institution. And in terms of what they wanted from them, they wanted a clear preference so that these students could gauge and further develop their occupational capacities and to check their readiness to gauge their readiness to engage in work. And in terms of processes, I was hoping that they would want to engage in peer groups and peer interactions, etc., etc. But oh no. What they wanted to be led or facilitated and guided by teachers and experts, i.e. clinicians, and these were far more preferred over student-organised and led processes. And obviously, their preference was for to be in groups of between 3 and 6, working with a teacher or a clinical practitioner, which is going to be dead expensive. And I can see Carol Joy is winding me up here. So I'll just, this is the data, this is what the students wanted, and what you'll see, exactly what I said, is that their preference was for this kind of experience. And in this particular survey, we said, what would you not participate in? And look at the figures down there for things like online with peers, dead popular, and presentations by peers. All these things were not popular. So the point is there were things there that students would be reluctant to engage in. As an analysis just did over the weekend of this data, what we find is there's different, perhaps not surprising, there's different interests by students at different stages in their program. And in this table here, we have students at 2 stages. Stage 1 is those in the 1st and 2nd year, and stage 2 is those that go from the 3rd to the 5th year. That's because we have medical students in there. And overall, what it's suggesting is that the students in the first stage, year 1 and 2, are far more interested in talking about their practicums than those in the 3rd and 4th year. This then leads, this and other things that I've been looking at, leads to the conclusion about how we might organise experiences for our students. And the suggestion here is that initially we might take an approach where there's more guidance, direct guidance for students, and then perhaps later engage them in more personally mediated processes such as their evaluation, introspection, or what is often referred to as reflection. So this is just saying that over the life of a student in their program, it might be worthwhile thinking about more guided approaches initially and then more personally mediated approaches, which also leads them then into that process of being ready to manage their own learning across working life. To finish, a couple of emerging issues is that one of the curious things about the government's decision to give the money to students rather than institutions is that although this is about supply and demand, in a curious way it actually distorts the supply. And that is, students then will select courses they want to do, so the actual supply becomes more based around student interest or what students might think is appropriate. And I believe that in our university we teach criminology on 3 campuses. And of course every week I see all these jobs for criminologists. So you wonder about the relationship between the supply and demand and how that's going to play out across higher education generally, but also if there is a mismatch between, for instance, what students want to do and the kind of work that's available and employers being willing to provide work experiences, this questions the ability to provide authentic experiences for our students. And in other talks, and perhaps some of you have heard me talk about this, is that contemporary students are time jealous, not time poor. They're time jealous. Time poor is I don't have much time. Time jealousy is I need to use my time strategically and guard it jealously. So they will make decisions about how they use their time, and if the content or the assessment doesn't seem to be worthwhile, it won't be addressed. But also our good selves. We're all time jealous because of the demands upon our workload. And the other thing is that the workplaces are becoming increasingly resource jealous because they're having so many demands made upon them. Hence now they can charge for access. And the final thing is that we'll reach a point, I think, before too long, where we're not able to provide authentic experiences for our students in the workplaces. And then I think there'll be a move to try and work out how we can provide authentic experiences within higher education institutions. A couple of weeks ago, I was at Temasek Polytech in Singapore, and the IT students, what they do, first of all, is they actually service the students' computers. So when a student comes into the Polytech, it is the IT students that set them up, because it's all a bring your own device type arrangement. So the students are engaged in that. The students are also engaged in monitoring the internet traffic that comes into the university, and I'm not sure how good I feel about this, but the students will also start doing the IT support for staff as part of their learning experience. So when we reach the point, and by the way, in the Netherlands, that is also a part of their, in the HBO system, the applied universities, that's very much what they do. So beyond this consideration of having authentic experiences, which is the focus of this topic, this seminar today, a question I think in the future will become how can we provide authentic experiences in higher education institutions to in some sense complement, augment, or even as a substitute for what students can't have in the workplace. Thank you very much.